One day, there was a young farm boy, and he was pulling along a giant cart of corn loaded up, a wagon full, and he had an accident. It accidentally overturned, and corn spilled everywhere, and it was just a mess. There was a big loud bang, and there was a local neighbor that heard the commotion and thought he'd see what's going on. He looks out, and he sees what's happening, and he recognizes the young boy, and he says, "Hey, Will, looks like you've made yourself a real mess. Listen, why don't you just forget your troubles for a bit? Come on in. We got dinner made. You can eat with us, and I'll help you clean up your mess afterwards, and I'll help you clean the wagon up." And the boy answered Will. He says, "That's mighty nice of you, but I just don't think my dad's going to like that very much." He says, "Oh, come on, son. There's no harm. Come on in. We've got dinner ready." And he convinced him to come in. The boy finally agreed. He says, "I'll come, but I just really don't think my dad's going to like this." They sat down. They enjoyed a beautiful home-cooked meal together, moved on to dessert, enjoyed and savored dessert. And the young boy, Will, he thanked his host. He says, I feel a lot better now, but just know my dad's going to be real upset." Farmer said, "Don't be silly. By the way, where is your dad?" And the boy answered, "Well, he's under the wagon." Hey, if you have been tracking along with us through the book of Amos as we read along, you will have encountered an angry farmer of your own this week as we've read through the book of Amos. I want to say good morning to you here at the factory. There's people listening in online. Maybe you're joining in from the lake. It's good to be together on this weekend. And, we're on our journey as a church for 1,000 days, reading a chapter a day, making our way through the entire Scripture. If you've been joining along, we're thrilled that you're doing that. It's a really meaningful journey for many of us. We're hearing so many stories. If you're visiting and you want to join in, we grab a bookmark, and they've got our reading plan, or you can download the app, and if you're really adventurous, play catch up to where we've been. But I hope you've been tracking along. And so this last week, as we've been reading, we turned the pages from where we've been for a little while in the book of 1 Samuel, and we've turned the pages over to the book of Amos. And I want to talk a little bit about what was happening in the days of Amos. As we turn these pages, we certainly know that we have this man that surfaced named Amos who seems rather angry, but I want to kind of set the tone for what was happening in the scene of Israel. You see, this man Amos was a simple, small-town farmer. He was from a small town named Tekoa. It was about, Tokia. It was about 7 miles south of Jerusalem. It was a humble little town, and maybe for us, I'd liken it to a town like Gretna, a little far removed from the main city. It was a farming town, a farming small community. To go into the city was sort of a big adventure, or a day's worth of work, or more. And so it's sort of this small community that kept to itself for the most part. And so Amos was a sheep herder, and he also farmed sycamore figs on a farm in this small town. He wasn't known by anyone besides maybe his neighbors, his local community. He wasn't from a family that had any sort of notoriety. It was just sort of a simple small-town farmer. But as we meet this farmer named Amos, we need to understand where in Israel's history is placed, because if we want to understand this book that he wrote, this poem actually that he wrote, we need to understand where Israel is at. We've just spent our time journeying through the book of 1 Samuel. We've watched as the Israelites left captivity. They've now entered the promised land, this area that they've been anticipating, and they've elected their first kings, and they begin to develop as a nation and just sort of take residence in this space. But when we come to the book of Amos, there's actually hundreds of years that have transpired since that time, and much has shifted. These memories from 1 Samuel are distant or even forgotten. In fact, what's happened for the nation of Israel is that they've entered a time in their nation of peace and prosperity like no other that they've ever experienced. All of the surrounding nations had begun to fight with each other. And so Israel is this safe country, and at this point, a result of this is that all the trade routes made their way through the land of Israel. And because of that, it brought in this steady influx of economic trade and success. And over time, it had built into basically a superpower nation, one that was full of prosperity, a strong economy. There was this booming military, and the economy was just going fantastic. There was kind of a shift to big businesses that moved in and took up residence, and the economy sort of shifted around them. And so Israel was at the pinnacle of their nation of power, of prestige, privilege, of prosperity, and peace. And on top of this, for the Israelites, religion was flourishing. In fact, I would say they experienced a revival of sorts. People were dedicated to coming to the temple and worshiping God. The temple was flourishing. Tithes were being given. People thronged to their annual festivals and their feasts and their celebration. They were faithful. You might say they were the type of people that never missed a Sunday. And life was great. Prosperity, comfort, peace, revival. They are living out the dream that had been promised to their nation. The promise of blessing. And this idea that God was on their side. However, underneath the surface, there was another reality that was lurking. And it was the reality that we see Amos uncover as he writes, in the midst of this booming economy, many people were flourishing, but silently and sometimes not, the poor were suffering. Mainly because the systems of the economy had created a context where the rich, where the wealthy were living off the exploitations of the poor. For many, they probably didn't even know this was happening, or they turned a blind eye to the impact of this. And this would become the dominant message that we read in the book of Amos, to turn a blind eye to injustice was to miss God entirely. That for God to ignore issues of justice or to relegate them to the sidelines of our faith was to miss the entire point. Now, if you've been reading along with us this week, you will know that Amos does not hold back his words. I mean, he truly seems like a rather angry individual. In fact, Amos was one of the most unpopular characters in Israel's history because he brought this heavy-handed, angry message of warning and doom and sort of judgment during their time of greatest national prosperity. Amos's message was intrusive. It was confrontational. It interrupted and challenged the comforts that they found themselves in. It interfered with their lifestyles, and it challenged their notion that their prosperity was a result of God's blessing. And for those who heard him, his message seemed ridiculous. To suggest that with all of their military power, with all of their economic stability, that there was some sort of impending doom on its way. I mean, how far-fetched was this? And so here is the man Amos, a small-town, no-name fig tree farmer who was written off as an unrealistic, over-dramatic, grumpy old nut, and whose message they would ignore but would eventually prove to be one that they should have taken seriously. And I think a message that has much to say to us here today. So as we open up to Amos, if you brought your Bibles, you can open up to the book of Amos. It's one of the last 12 books of the Old Testament, and you can look it up in your table of contents. The words will be up on the screen as well. But we're going to journey through the first few chapters of the book of Amos together. As we open up to chapter 1, essentially this book that we read is Amos that had composed a poem. It's a poem that he recorded, that he wrote down, and then he went and put on a public performance of this poem, of this message at the temple as they celebrated their festival together. And so as we begin reading this, I want you to picture the scene with me. Amos journeys from Tekoa up to Bethel, and Bethel was where the king's chapel was, and so much of the religious activity happened around there. It was sort of a prominent place for many. And so he goes up to the king's chapel, and as we journey there, you can imagine their service was about to start. I mean, it was a time of their religious calendar where there was feasting and there was celebrations, and they're about to sit down. They planned this big old potluck to happen after church. But they're sitting down for their service, and there's this priest named Amaziah. Pastor Amaziah, he stands to his feet on the stage, and he's about to begin the service. The countdown clock just reached 0, and they're ready to roll. And all of a sudden, they hear this commotion just outside. There's a disturbance. You hear somebody with an angry voice sort of yelling, essentially, and everybody kind of peers out, and they sneak out, and they go see what's going on here. And here they find this small farmer from Tekoa. They didn't recognize him, but this sort of uninvited, hillbilly, rustic man starts to stand up and recite a poem before them. So they kind of perk up and start to listen, and here's what they hear. It says, these are the words that Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, he says this: "The Lord roars from Zion." And he begins to go into the first rendition of his poem, which says this: "For the 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent." And then he just lambastes Damascus and what their sin was, and he just pronounces God's judgment on this. And at this point, the people hear this, and they're sort of like, oh, their ears perk up, and they sort of say, this is interesting, because Damascus is one of their enemies. And he's throwing them under the bus. He's saying, here's what's wrong with Damascus, and God's not happy with them, and here's what's going to happen. And they're interested. They're kind of getting involved. And then he begins to repeat this phrase all the way through chapter 1 and 2, for the 3 sins, even for 4, which essentially is just saying for their excessive rebellion, for their excessive sins. And he goes on, it says, "For the 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not relent." And he throws Gaza under the bus with all their sins and says God's judgment is coming to them. And he carries on, "For the 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4, I will not relent." And he throws all that to Tyre, and he says God's judgment is coming on them. He says, "For the 3 sins of Edom, for 4, I will not relent. For the 3 sins of Ammon, even for 4, I will not relent." And he carries on and carries on. He says, "For the 3 sins of Moab, even for 4, I will not relent." And do you see what he's doing? He's standing up and saying, all of your surrounding nations, all these enemies, all these people that you have been in battle with, that you don't get along with, that you don't see eye to eye with. And he starts listing off all their rebellions, all their sins, and says God's judgment is coming on. I can imagine the crowd just sort of hooting and hollering and saying, amen, and they're getting into this. They like this guy. This uninvited hillbilly is gaining some popularity around their midst. Everybody's kind of getting into it. They're reveling as they see the guilt of their enemies, of those they don't see eye to eye with, being paraded, and the upcoming punishment that God will have for them. And so they're into it. And then in chapter 2, as he carries on, it gets even juicier, because he says this: "For the 3 sins of Judah, even for 4, I will not relent." And you understand that Judah was sort of like the estranged sister of Israel. They didn't see eye to eye always. They didn't really get along. Sort of the sibling rivalry. But for him to stand up and to say these guys are in rebellion and God's not happy with them, I mean, they sort of resounded in that way to say, yeah, Judah too. This is great. And so they're all enthused. I mean, he's doing a brilliant job of luring his listeners into this feeling for themselves of immunity as he focuses on the sins of all the surrounding nations, of God's judgment that's going to be coming in the inferior Judah. And they're anticipating the message to end this way. An exuberant declaration that God will continue to give them victory and blessing over all the surrounding nations, and to announce that God's blessing will continue in their midst, because that has been their dominant story. That God's blessing has brought prosperity, that his promises have brought this blessing in their midst. But a terrible shock was about to drop as Amos continues to recite his poem, because he flips it right around and he says this in verse 6: "For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent." And suddenly, what was enthusiasm turns to silent faces. And suddenly, this hillbilly farmer is not so welcome anymore. And what he does is he goes on to list their sins, and their list is much longer. than any of the other lists of the nations, and even for Judah. And so Amos brilliantly gathers these people and begins to enlist their attention, and then he flips it right at them and he looks them in the eye and says, "This is God's judgment against you. These are the sins, these are the rebellions that I want you to know are happening in your midst." And so he goes on, and we're going to walk through some of the pronouncements that he makes. And right after this, in chapter 2, verse 6, he goes on to say this. These are the judgments against Israel that Amos gives. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Now you have to understand, silver was sort of their way of referring to debt. It alludes to debt. And so they're saying there's these innocent people, there's these vulnerable people that you are overloading with debt, and this is an oppressive force against those in vulnerable situations. Even small debts that are overturning and having grave consequences, and you're sort of, putting them under the power of these unfair debts. And he says, and you sell the needy for a pair of sandals. When you look back at the Hebrew language, what this is referring to is actually somebody that was in an oppressive slavery situation. So they have a master that's not treating them fairly, and they would flee from it. They would run and escape, and when they found refuge somewhere, if an individual, there was a law written that if you brought that slave back to that master, they would pay you back by giving you a pair of shoes. And so they're referring to this, that what's happening is that these people that were in vulnerable places were trying to find freedom or find a safe haven, and they're returning them to their oppression for pennies, for a pair of shoes. He says in verse 7, they trample on the heads of the poor as on dust of the ground. We have to understand that the economy has shifted in Israel, where they were once a nation that were nomadic, where they even took shape as just sort of local farmers that were working together, but big business had taken over. As the trade routes came through, and all of a sudden now, it became an economy in which the local farmers were being saddled with debt and being bought out, all for big business. And so there's all these farmers losing over debts and over the power of the big economy, and they're being ground into the ground, in debt. And so he says, you trample on the heads of the poor and on the dust of the ground. And he says, and you deny justice to the oppressed. Even when you read later in chapter 5, he expounds on what was happening there. And essentially, it was a situation where there was people that had privilege. There were people that sort of were housed the power, and they would be able to force the best outcomes out of the court systems to weigh them in their favor. And so what you had was a system where the people that had power and privilege could manipulate the outcomes of the courts, but those that didn't, those that were in poverty or that couldn't voice for themselves, suffered under a system that was stacked against them. Even small debts or small offenses that they would have in the court system would have monumental consequences in their life. He says, you deny justice even in the courts. I remember vividly an experience I had a few years ago. I had an individual that we were working with and helping, and somebody that was a friend of ours, but living and struggling in low income. He was an immigrant, and it was in the middle of a court battle, and it was sort of this unfair court battle. It was about custody. It was about some sort of unfair asks that were being made of him financially. And he came to me because he said, I don't have money, so I've been assigned a lawyer, but I'm so frustrated because I just feel like he won't even listen to me. Nothing's happening. I can't get anywhere, and I feel helpless. And so I said, well, book a meeting with your lawyer, and I'll come, and we'll just sit, because I just wanted to see what's actually going on. And so we booked a meeting and sat down and went through some of the issues, and it was great. Great meeting. We sat there and kind of outlined the issues. There were some action plans that happened out of that, and I thought, I don't know what he's referring to here, but this feels fine. Like, this is great. So we walked out feeling like there's some resolve here, and I'll never forget, because as soon as we left that office, he stopped me and he looked at me and he said, I've never been treated with dignity like that. And wonder, like, what is it? Is it my skin color? Is it race? Is it because I have privilege or power? I don't know what it is that changed the nature of that conversation. And that's maybe even a more subtle form, but those types of injustices happen all over, where it is stacked against the odds for those that we don't give the benefit of the doubt to, for those that the system does not work for. I think oftentimes we put our help for those in need under a heading of charity. In some sense, you should be doing it, and if you don't, you're kind of stingy, and you're kind of, you're holding on too much. But really, in many ways, we consider it an extracurricular activity. But according to Amos, as we read through this, we have our obligation to help those in need is not seen as extracurricular. It's considered as the root cause of injustice. In fact, in Hebrew, the word Hebrew, mishpat, which refers to justice, occurs over 1,000 times as we walk through Scripture, and typically in the context of 4 classes of people, of the widows, of the orphans, of the foreigners, and of the poor. And the point isn't that this is some sort of an exclusive list of who we should be helping, but it's indicating those who find themselves in vulnerability. Those who are without a voice, those who are without an advocate, those who are helpless in their situation, those of whom are vulnerable to being taken advantage of and susceptible to the forces of oppression through our systems and through other people. And in Scriptures, the just person is the person who is enacting justice in their lives is the one who sees his or her resources as belonging to the whole community, carrying a fundamental responsibility towards one another. But those that Amos was addressing didn't really see it this way. Their riches were theirs. Their wealth had been earned by them and their hard work to be primarily used for their own benefit, and they were often oblivious and ignorant to those who were struggling and to those who were in vulnerable places. It was out of sight. It was out of mind. They put their blinders up and they lived on in their own comforts. And they didn't ask the questions of where have my successes or where has my privilege been on the back of somebody who's being taken advantage of. They never asked the difficult questions like even how is the very land that we stand on the result of vulnerabilities being exploited. And he carries on, Amos, in his judgments against Israel. In 2 verse 7, he carries on and says this: Father and son used the same girl and so profaned my holy name. And here's what he was saying here. He's calling out gender-based violence and abuse that was happening. And he's saying those who are in privileged places aren't feeling the consequences of their actions. It's unfair. Those who are vulnerable are helpless. And it's being glossed over. And he calls it out. And he carries on in 2 verse 8, and he says, they lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. You know what the garments were their outer garments, like a coat that they would wear, but also it would double for them as their blankets to keep them warm at night. And if you trace back to Exodus, there was actually a law that was written that said when somebody gives their garment in pledge, you must return it to them by the evening so that they're not cold at night. And he's saying, listen, you are lying down and making your comforts out of the garments taken in pledge. That means if you had to give your garment sort of to pawn it off in pledge in order to access maybe food or shelter or whatever it might be, that indicates that's the only thing you have to offer of value. It indicates that you're living in poverty. And so he's saying, listen, you're taking what these folks that are in poverty are using what they're giving you, creating your luxuries, and here they are cold through the night because you're using them. And he carries on in verse 8, he says, in the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines, almost calling out that even in their religious gatherings they're using their profits from religion. They're using religion as a way to create income and create luxury for themselves. And all the way through Amos, his words get sharper and sharper against these people. And so Amos stands in the midst of their temple during their worship service to a group of people that are living in peace and prosperity, a group of people that feel confident that they are living faithful to God and experiencing His blessing in their lives. And these are the judgments that he lists to them. You have turned a blind eye to the way the poor are being treated. You walk past the most vulnerable and you cross to the other side of the road so you don't have to pay attention to their plight. You are complicit with an economy that benefits you and yet takes advantage of those who are helpless. You allow power and privilege to work for your favor, but you ignore those who are mistreated and have no voice. You turn a blind eye to the violence and abuse and to those that are experiencing the vulnerabilities of those things, and you let those off because of their privilege that are causing it. You build your comforts from the debts of the poor, and you leave them to suffer out in the cold, and you're using your religion even to profit and to live in excess on the backs of those that are being taken advantage of. And Amos does not mince his words, does he? In fact, he literally says, here is God. He is like a roaring lion. He is furious. Nothing is further from God's heart than the existence of injustice. Justice is not a side project of the Bible. It is not a side project of our faith. It stems from the very character of God Himself. And the book of Amos is not first and foremost a call to social action. It is a call to repentance, to return back to the very heart and character of God Himself, which Amos says at its center is a return to justice. If we were to be honest here together, these words are being read in a context today where the majority of us have grown up in the same privilege, much like the people of Amos' day. The privilege of opportunity, the privilege of access to education or even university, privilege of perhaps being in the majority culture where you're given the benefit of the doubt in every situation and others are not. The privilege of stable housing, and the list could go on and on. Now listen, there is nothing immoral about being in a position of privilege. But justice demands that we use our privilege to help empower and to advocate and to fight for equality and to enable opportunity and to address the vulnerabilities of the most vulnerable around us. This last week, I sat in my office, and our refuge team was telling me a story about what was happening. Our refuge is our program for women in the neighborhood. It's amazing some of the things that this group is doing. But they sat there and told me about a 19-year-old girl who we've known for quite a while and just has grown up in a really broken home situation. A lot of trauma. Parents have struggled incessantly with addictions. Her mother passed away years ago. And because of this environment, she's had her own battles with addictions and a struggle with meth. And really has no place to call home, but she had a stroke at 19. And so she had an extended stay in the hospital. And they told me about what they were doing to sort of gather around this young lady and to support her and to access resources that she might need. And the heartbreaking piece was, it said, like, there is no one, not one in her life that cares that she's in the hospital, that visits her. I'm so proud of the work these folks are doing from Refuge to surround her and to visit her and to at least let her know that she's seen and she carries dignity and value. And even, they're telling me that even she's supposed to go through rehab and all she has is a pair of pajamas on and nothing else. And so they went to EIA to get a check for her living expenses. And because she's in the hospital, the policy gets applied and her living expense check for the month was $24. She's supposed to what? Go get some clothes so that she can go to rehab. And so these types of oppression, these types of injustices happen all around us, and we see them all the time. It's exactly why we're putting so much effort and energy into this project we call Riverwood House. We have this vision to create a 40-unit housing complex. This is the most recent rendering of it. If you look to the very right, that's the fire hall. So it's right beside the fire hall. We've bought and purchased this land, and these are the current plans that we're working towards funding. We're hoping that in just under 2 years' time, this is going to be fully operational. Yeah. But let me say this, as we've been working towards this project, it's what we would call recovery housing, meant to be a safe and stable house with built-in supports and a communal experience for those that are going through recovery, through addictions and mental health. Yes. But as we've been working towards this, there's been so much effort that we've had to put into researching and to understanding the issues. And let me say, the addiction crisis in Winnipeg is a real thing. We see it on the news. But as you dig into it and you watch and you see the trauma that people grow up in, that the outcome of that is the coping mechanisms and the struggle with addictions that emerge. And then you take somebody struggling with one of these things and they say, you know what, I want to take a good step here. And they try and enroll in some help, and all of the resources available have waiting lists. And then even if they do make it into that and they make some steps towards recovery in 3 months, in 6 months, 12 months, whenever that program ends, what happens? They're placed right back into their vulnerable situations, into homelessness or into homes that are just so at risk. And the cycle just goes and goes and goes. And the whole point of this is to break the cycle of injustice. To say, here is a safe and stable home that you can journey to full recovery in the midst of community, in the midst of a loving community, and with access to supports, and to say, every one of you deserves this in your life. I'm so proud of the team that's about to head back to Eswatini, to Swaziland, where we've been in relationship with these two communities over the last 10 years. We've got 17 people that are heading back to Eswatini from Riverwood to go and connect with over 300 kids that are being sponsored here as a church. And we've watched over this last decade as these kids in the most vulnerable places, struggling with the highest HIV/AIDS impacted country in the world, in the grasp of poverty, in the grasp of drought. And yet we've been able to infuse and come alongside these children and give them access to education and clean drinking water and food every day and health care, and to watch them grow up and to break those cycles of injustice and to give them opportunity. And we got a team that's heading back there to continue to tell these kids that they're worth it, they're valuable, and they have dignity before God. And even to the levels where we have food banks that operate throughout the week. And we've recently developed what we call our food policy. You know what our food policy says? When people bring donations of food to our food bank, we run it through a grid and we say if it's too high in sugar and it's too high in sodium, we turn it away. We say it's not allowed in this facility. You know why? Because when you do the data, when you do the research, when you live in poverty, diabetes and heart disease are exponentially higher as a result of that. And yet so often we take in these donations under the name of charity and we give help that is actually hurting. And that's working towards justice as we say, no, our help must be helpful, and we're working with relationships and partnerships to bring more healthy food so that our help is actually doing something positive. You see, for Amos, the most infuriating part for him in all of his words, all of his judgments were happening in the midst of what was a religious revival. In the midst of what was fervent devotion from the Israelites to a return to their religion. It was prominent. They were faithful to the feasts and to the temple meetings and to singing and to celebrating and to worship together. And listen to what Amos says in chapter 5, 21 to 23. He says, woe for you who long for the day of the Lord. He says, I hate and I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring me your choice fellowship offerings, though you bring me your very best, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Wow. Intense words. And Amos accuses the people of using their privilege and their blessing for their own comforts and benefits, all the while turning a blind eye to the suffering of the vulnerable around them. And I genuinely ask this question of us today. Should a humble farmer from Gretna show up at the back of the auditorium and speak these words? Would we write him off as a lunatic? As somebody disturbing our peace and our religious gathering? Or would we recognize and take ownership of the truth that at the very center of God's heart, whom we gather to worship today, is a commitment to justice in the world around us? And that all of this is essentially meaningless if we don't make it a part of our faith in everyday life. I think as religious people, we tend to build these walls and compartmentalize what we would call the sacred and the secular. We compartmentalize our faith as we gather here. These are sacred moments. And we define our faith in terms of private and individual journeys. And we even, come to church faithfully and exercise generosity and even sing with passion. But then there's real life in the real world, and we kind of compartmentalize these two things. Amos's poem is like a battering ram blowing these walls apart. You cannot separate worship and justice. Worship is how we relate to God, and justice is how we relate to each other. Not just in these walls, but everywhere. You cannot separate worship and justice. False religion says as long as we just believe right and as long as we worship right, well, how we treat our neighbor can be rather inconsequential. And we convince ourselves that we can hide our sins within the context of our worship. Even Jesus calls this out. He says, woe to you who devour widows' houses, essentially saying, woe to you who evict those who cannot pay their rent. And at the very same time, you offer up lengthy prayers. Is our faith relegated to this separated realm of the sacred? Absolutely not. God is concerned with civil policy. He is concerned with affordable rent. He is concerned with the truth and reconciliation movement. He is concerned with homelessness and addictions and unfair court systems. He is concerned about gender-based violence. He is concerned, and the list could go on and on and on. And God is absolutely concerned with these things where the most vulnerable are forgotten, are taken advantage of, and have oppressions that are on them, whether that's from societal structures or whether that's from other people. These are intensely spiritual matters because it allows us, if we ignore them, to live in our lives of seeming comfort and prosperity, and even with the idea of God's blessing, and all the while turn a blind eye to the vulnerabilities and injustices around us. And in doing so, we fail to acknowledge the very image of God in every human. If we become followers of Jesus and have no concern for justice, we've missed the whole point. You cannot read through the life of Jesus. You cannot read through the entire story of Scripture and not see this plain as day, if you ask my opinion. And so after all the accusations and judgments that he places, Amos moves on in verse 24 and says these words of hope. He says, but let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness, another word for justice, like a never-ending stream or an ever-flowing stream. And it says, but let justice roll like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I had an opportunity recently to travel on a road trip with my family through Yellowstone Park. Beautiful, if you've never been. But there's a famous river that flows through called the Yellowstone River. And this was a picture I was able to take. There's one spot you go see where it's just beautiful in the canyon, and there's a waterfall where the river has carved its way through, and you just see how this river has formed these canyons. You know, as I hear Amos's words, let justice roll like a river, ever flowing, I think about this and think that this constant rushing water has carved its way through some of the most difficult terrain, through some of the strongest elements of our world, and yet an ever-flowing stream that has carved its way through and will not be stopped. And as Amos shouts out this prayer in the midst of his anger, in the midst of God's judgment, he says, listen, I'm calling you to action. In the face of all of this, let justice roll like a river. Let it roll over the oppressions that we see in our world. Let it roll over the selfishness that drives us to our own comforts on the backs of those that are cold at night. Let it roll over the ignorance as we turn a blind eye to those that are in injustice. Let it roll over the violence and the abuse that is happening around us. Let it roll over the impact of poverty in our world. Let it roll over injustice. And may it roll through, never ending, carving its way and creating a world full of justice, just as God had designed us to be. Amos confronts, but he says, listen, God's calling you to action. He's calling us to action, to say our faith must pursue justice in this world around us if we want to get it right. And so that's the call for all of us. As we read Amos, these are some angry words for a long weekend, aren't they? But we carry on as we walk through the Bible and we let the full force of them take shape here. And it's a call for all of us. Work towards justice in our world. It is an integral part of the heart of God. And as we follow Jesus, it's a call for every one of us. We're going to end our service, ironically, by singing a song after Amos's words. So I'd like to invite you to stand, but one of the words in this song I think are pretty powerful. It's a fun song, but it says, let us sing, let us dance as until the earth echoes the heavens. The heavens were the rule, where the rule of God was, where the kingdom of God was in full force, biblically. And so this song says, until our earth has echoes of justice coming down as it is in heaven here on earth. And let's sing this with fervency, and let's sing this as a prayer today, that we will sing, we will dance in our worship, not just here, but in the world around us, until the earth echoes the heavens.